This week, the agenda examined the conflict over Crimea, weighed the efficacy of mammograms at detecting breast cancer, and looked at how global citizenry is changing our relationship with democracy. The Agenda's Week in Review begins with getting things growing in Ontario. Weather, drought, California. We've read a lot about it lately, despite the rain they got just before the Academy Awards. How worried should we be about the cost of our food rising because of some weather event in a place a long way away from us?
You should be. The truth is that weather is the one thing farmers can't control. The reality is we are seeing not just the impacts of weather, but the impacts of probably humanity, if you want to do it for lack of a better word, in that, you know, you've got millions of arable acres in China no longer functioning for food production, heavy metal contamination, no water, lack of resources. That's going to impact upon everything that we do. And frankly, Canadians, amongst all the industrial nations, have one of the lowest costs per capita for food anywhere. We run about 8% of our disposable incomes versus, say, Nigeria, where 87% of their disposable income goes to food. We should be damn lucky.
Carolyn, in your experience, how much do you think we think about these far-off weather-related events that presumably can have an impact on our bottom line?
I think there's a growing number of Ontarians who are thinking about it. I think there's a growing number of opportunities to think about where our food comes from, and there's more and more people dedicating their time and resources to that. So I think it's great to think about, you know, having your food coming from different places in the world where there's a competitive advantage, but I also think it's important to think about having a diversity of distribution chains and a diversity of different agricultural types in Ontario.
Brenda, if you live in a city, chances are if you're asked where does your food come from, you say, well, the grocery store, of course.
Right.
You want us to think a little deeper than that, I presume.
Absolutely. And we've been really fortunate in Ontario that our Ministry of Agriculture has a program called Foodland Ontario, which has done a tremendous job to promote local food and also all types of food, not just, I come from horticulture, and it also is promoting everything from baked goods to bacon anymore. So yes, when you go to the grocery store, there's lots of signage and information saying that this food is from Ontario and it is fresh.
I want to do two things here. Number one, can you open up your shot, Brendan, just a little bit? Because we're only seeing the top of that pin, and I want people to see the whole pin, because you're wearing what?
I'm wearing asparagus, and it's kind of my trademark. So whenever I go to represent agriculture, I wear my asparagus brooch. So
okay.
Thank you for noticing it.
And you wear it because?
I'm an asparagus farmer. My husband and I produce asparagus in the southwest corner of Norfolk County at a place called Spirit Farms.
And you are not spelling Spirit S-P-I-R-I-T.
No, S-P-E-A-R-I-T.
Spirit, as in right. How you eat asparagus.
That's right.
It's like, okay. You also mentioned Foodland Ontario, and
yes.
We do know this jingle, but what the heck, let's play it anyway, okay? We got a little tape here. Let's roll it. Roll tape, please.
It's closer than you think. It's so close you can taste it. It's fresh, it's local, and it's made for you.
You want to sing it?
Good used to good things grow in Ontario.
Everybody knows it. The ad must be working. Everybody knows it. Going back, okay, Evan, to our earlier question about what happens a long way away and how it can have an impact on us. How vulnerable do you think we are here in the province of Ontario to international food shocks that take place obviously elsewhere?
It's a fabulous question. Jamie mentioned the fact that we only spend about 8% of our income on food, which gives us a huge buffer, frankly, from international commodity markets. If prices go up on the international markets and we see our food price go up, really in terms of our household income, it's a relatively small proportion. So while high food prices is a problem for lots of people, in terms of our vulnerability, say, versus the people in the developing world that were mentioned a second ago, we're much less vulnerable because we don't spend as much of our money on food.
You used to be ag minister, though, once upon a time. As you look back over the past couple of decades, how vulnerable does it look to you for how we are?
Look at Ontario 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. Spring break, 28 degrees, 90% of the apple crop in Ontario was destroyed as a result of that. And one of the things we're trying to advocate for from the food processing side is that we need to look at new opportunities to add value to it. 65% of everything that's grown or produced in Ontario has value added to it. How can we work and take advantage of the quick freeze facility that exists down in Delhi and start to freeze those asparagus so that we can eat Ontario asparagus year round? Yeah. Finding we've lost a pickle industry. We've other than Sunshine Pickles down in Thamesville, we have no. Bix is gone, Stubbs is gone. So we've lost a lot of our value added or our processing infrastructure. And we think that the fresh is important. We're never going to say anything negative about that. But we need to find ways to add value. And that's what we're advocating in food processing is we need to turn back the clock. The days of old when every little town, the Aylmer brand isn't Aylmer, Quebec. It's from Aylmer Evaporating and Canning Company in Aylmer, Ontario. And every little town had a canning company. We've lost this whole infrastructure. So we see some potential to help create jobs in rural Ontario and bring back some really good factories that added value to what we grow.
Steve, the majority of all the processors did leave over the last 20 years, economics or otherwise. You can't find a processor basically east of the Colorados, of the Rockies. They've all gone overseas. So the pickles that you speak of so fondly are now done in India.
Well, come see Frost Farms in Elgin County, and they have 40 growers that grow the most amazing cucumbers right here in Ontario, and those cucumbers all get shipped to the States to have value added.
But I think you're both absolutely right. Over the last 25 years, there has been a hemorrhaging of North America's or Ontario's food processing industry. For me, that represents a really obvious sort of low-hanging fruit to increase the resilience of Ontario's food economy, create better links between urban consumers and rural producers, such as Brenda, and re-inject jobs into a part of the Ontario landscape that is desperately in need of economic opportunities.
But Brenda, what happens when we take that asparagus that Steve just talked about and we freeze it for 6 months so that we'll have more flexibility in terms of bringing it to market? What happens to that food?
Actually, the individual quick freeze, which is called IQF, is probably a better representation of the crop 6 months later because it's frozen at peak of freshness. It captures that freshness. And
so we don't lose anything by waiting the 6 months?
No. And also, in order for us to open up export markets, if we aren't able to add value to the perishable crops that we grow, we're losing that opportunity also. And there's huge opportunities opening up in the export market. So by adding value, whether it's dehydrating or freezing, it's very difficult to export anything. So
I want to add to, you were mentioning Sunshine Pickles. Well, there's, I think, a huge market too in Ontario for this developing local food and organic and ecological growing, a whole spectrum of thinking about our environmental consequences and our social impact with food. And it's not just Foodland Ontario. There's, Savor Ottawa. There's a local brand, Taste Real Guelph. There's a whole bunch of local brands that are looking at regional food economies. And it's not just about creating one big food chain throughout Ontario. It's about creating a food web. And that's what resilience is about. It's creating that diversity and complexity, both at the farm level, at the soil level, and at the distribution level as well, so that farmers have lots of options.
Walter Russell-Mead got us started. I like simple questions, so let's start simple. Why has Russia done what it's done?
Well, I think some people have been saying because it can. But I think, President Putin considers the future of Ukraine something that Russia can't ignore. It's a vital interest. He was worried about Crimea. He saw an opportunity where the West had sort of let things slip. There was a gap between our rhetoric and what we were ready to do, and he moved very quickly.
Nina, your view on why Russia has done what it's done?
Because it can. I mean, I think it's very well put. And also, Crimea being such an important interest of Russia was under Russian control until 1954, and then by chance got out of the Russian control. So Putin considers it his own territory, and therefore he feels that he can annex it as he just announced.
Jeffrey, just because you can doesn't mean you should. Should they have done this?
Well, it was a propitious time for them to do it because their client had just fallen from power in Ukraine.
Yanukovych.
President Yanukovych had fallen from power, and the country has kind of, descended into a mild degree of anarchy. And under the conditions of lack of public authority, this made it all the much easier for Putin to go in to an area where he worried. And the reason he worried was because there's a treaty that Russia has signed with Ukraine to run their Black Sea fleet out of Crimea. And that treaty would normally not come up till 2042. They signed a treaty that long, but with whoever will be in power now, if it's not a Russian client, they'll probably have to leave there by 2017. That's what he's worried about.
Because they'll abrogate the treaty, or there's an out clause or something like that?
Yeah, they can get out of it.
They can get out of it. This, again, Lucan, on the face of it, may seem like an obvious question, but was this an invasion?
I'm not an expert on that, but I think most people would consider it an invasion when you have foreign troops coming on Ukraine's territory, yes. And I think also Putin is worried about his own political future. What happened in Ukraine is his own worst nightmare. I think that both in the Arab Spring in 2011 and the Ukrainian Revolution, you had autocrats who were considered quite strong, suddenly overthrown by spontaneous, leaderless revolts. And if that doesn't make you paranoid, well, I seriously don't know what would. And so I think what his main aim is, he wants to discredit this. He wants to show the Russian public that when this happens, what you have is chaos and hopefully civil war.
Hopefully civil war?
In Putin's mind.
In Putin's mind,
Yeah,
okay.
sorry, no.
Stavros, when were you most recently in Ukraine?
2012, during the parliamentary election.
And what did you do when you were there?
I was a long-term observer with the Canadian delegation, so I was there for 2 months in Poltava Oblast.
Which is where?
Which is not far from Kiev, about 3 hours.
And what did you do when you were there?
So the idea is to be responsible for that oblast, which is essentially a province, the equivalent in Ukraine or former Soviet Union, many of them, is to go around to kind of watch the process leading up to the election. So we'd go to different regions around, and you kind of get a sense of what the people are thinking in those villages, in those places that are outside of those big power centers that get more exposure, and that kind of everyday life, which is it's meat and potatoes, if you will, literally and figuratively.
Do you speak Ukrainian?
I do not. I speak Russian, and probably the first insight from that is that if you are in Ukraine, you are better off only speaking Russian than you are only speaking Ukrainian.
Why is that?
Because everybody speaks Russian and not everybody speaks Ukrainian. Most people, I would say, arguably everybody understands Ukrainian. But so there's that kind of scenario where you've got already, it's getting complicated because you've got ethnic Ukrainians who prefer Russian, but they are Ukrainian, and don't tell them they're Russian. So this starts to, I think we'll get into this in the hour, is that the idea that on face value and that kind of breaking headline is maybe not exactly the reality of people, how they live every day.
Okay, more to come on that. Again, back to geopolitics. Walter Russell Mead, the Crimea. What's so important about that, geopolitically speaking?
Well, I think we've mentioned it already, and that's those are the naval bases on that are there. Russia has facilities. If Russia does not have a lot of ports, good ports, and without the Crimea, it really doesn't have a way to project naval power into the Black Sea and the Mediterranean.
And is it your view that whatever treaty that had been negotiated with the guy who's now, I guess, actually out of power, but not technically out of power, that treaty is suspect enough that Putin had to do what he did?
I think he probably had. If the treaty were the only issue on his mind, I think he could have gotten some kind of an agreement. But we should clarify a little bit. Yanukovych wasn't exactly Putin's puppet. In fact, Yanukovych was going to sign the accession agreement with the European Union. And while he's a man who comes from the eastern part of the country, which historically people have considered a little bit closer to Russia, the fact that you had an Easterner willing to move Ukraine west was a huge danger to Putin. And Putin, in a sense, his strongest intervention was to force Yanukovych, a combination perhaps of bribery, perhaps of force, twisting arms behind the scenes, one doesn't know, but to force Yanukovych to give up his move toward the European Union, which then resulted in the kind of revolution that we saw. So Putin's worst case scenario was not this month, it was actually last November, at the prospect that a united Ukrainian under an Easterner would move toward the European Union. That would break up Putin's primary dream, which is the recreation kind of the Soviet Union under the guise of something he calls the Eurasian Union.
Okay.
And Putin saw a mortal threat to that dream, and I think that since then he's been acting to block it. He knows the West was eager to get Ukraine into that association with the European Union, and so he saw this as a direct challenge by the West to his vital interests. But he also saw the West hadn't thought much about it, hadn't realized how hard he would fight to defend himself there. And so he took an opportunity.
When you launched this study, and I guess we're going back to the 1980s now, when you launched the study, what was the advice that women typically got regarding mammograms?
Well, at that time, mammograms were not part of standard screening approaches to cancer. In fact, there had been a national and then an Ontario committee that had evaluated whether or not they should be, as a result of emerging information, particularly from the United States. But it had been decided that a program should not be introduced. And that was one of the major reasons we planned and eventually initiated the study.
And the age at which women were recommended to get mammograms 25 odd, 30 years ago was what?
Well, there was no age recommendation. There was no recommendation. But at the time we planned our study, there was information from a study in New York which suggested that mammography reduced deaths from breast cancer in women over the age of 50. But at the time we started, no evidence to suggest it was beneficial in women under the age of 50. But there was increasing evidence that mammography could detect cancers in women under the age of 50, and therefore we felt we should include a group age 40 to 49 in our study.
And has that changed today in terms of the recommended age at which a mammogram should be obtained?
There's some controversy over this. In Ontario, the standard recommendation is 50 or more, but it is possible for women under the age of 50 to get mammography. We are always talking here, incidentally, about women at normal risk. Women at ultra-high risk, there are other approaches advocated.
Of course. Okay, Dr. Kopans, thanks for your patience here. You know of the study. Let's just get your initial reaction to it, please.
Well, Steve, first of all, thank you for having me on. And I would like to make the point that this is not American radiologists attacking Canadians. The Canadian Association of Radiologists has issued a statement agreeing completely with the fact that the Canadian National Breast Screening Study was unfortunately compromised and that its data should not be used to guide recommendations for women. So that's not just the U.S. saying this is Canadian radiologists.
Let me just jump in there if I can, Dr. Kopans, because I actually have the Canadian organization's release here in front of me, saying that they too have concerns that the report is, quote, incredibly misleading analysis based on the deeply flawed and widely discredited Canadian National Breast Screening Study. The results of this BMJ study and other resulting from the CNBSS trial should not be used to create breast cancer screening policy. So we'll just get that on the record, and Dr. Miller, I'll give you a chance to speak to that in a second, but let's continue to get Dr. Kopans' position on what we've been talking about. Go ahead.
So, Steve, the vast majority of data from around the world clearly show that screening beginning at the age of 40 saves the most lives, and it's been shown in multiple randomized controlled trials. The Canadian study, unfortunately, is an outlier, and we can talk about why there were problems with the Canadian study if you'd like. I'm happy to go into the details. But the bottom line for women around the world, but certainly in the US and Canada, is that mammography screening beginning at the age of 40 is the best way to save the most lives. That's been shown repeatedly, and the reason that we're concerned about the publicity that the CNBSS has recently gotten is that the study, unfortunately, and I don't think this was intentional, had major problems with the way it was performed and actually used poor quality mammography. I was invited up in the 1990s because of concerns about the quality of the mammography. I was one of the reviewers asked by Professor Miller and his associate Dr. Baines to review the mammograms with two other radiologists, and we confirmed that the quality of the mammography for much, if not most of the trial was poor to unacceptable. The reference physicist, Professor Martin Yaffe at Sunnybrook, has reaffirmed his statement back in the 1990s that the quality of the mammography in the CNBSS was actually below what was being practiced in the community in Canada at the time. So there were major problems with the mammography. On top of that, when you do these trials, they're called randomized controlled trials. The fundamental requirement is that you take a large number of women, we're talking about tens of thousands, and you randomly divide them into two groups. The principle is that if the division is truly random, you should have perfectly identical groups. And as gruesome as it sounds, you'd have the same number of women developing breast cancer over the period of time and the same number of women dying in both groups if nothing else was done. Now, what was unfortunately done was that all the women had a clinical breast examination before they were assigned to be in one group, the mammography group, or in the other group that didn't get mammography.
And you think that compromises the test?
Well, that's a major violation of randomized controlled trials. Well, let me just finish, and then, Tony, you can answer. You're supposed to allocate women without knowing anything about them. All the other randomized controlled trials that have been done first randomly divided women and then invited them to be screened. So number one, the clinical examination was done. They knew, the examiners, they were nurses and doctors who did the examination, wrote down whether a woman had a lump in her breast, many of which were cancer, and whether they had lumps in their underarms, which would indicate advanced cancer, cancer in the lymph nodes in the underarm. That was then given to the coordinators. Now, this has been documented. This isn't me making
Okay, let me jump in here if I can, Dr. Kopens. I want to give Dr. Miller a chance to speak to these two issues. Number one, the quality of the mammography involved, and number two, the allocation, as Dr. Kopens just described it.
Okay. The statement of the Canadian Association of Radiologists is disappointing because we collaborated with them in setting up the study. We worked very hard with radiologists. We had an expert radiologist from the United States come up and advise us, and we carried out the films in accordance with the procedures approved by the Canadian Association of Radiologists. In terms of the randomization, as Dr. Kopens knows, when he made his accusations, there was an investigation carried out by the National Cancer Institute of Canada and the University of Toronto. This is because he accused me of scientific misconduct in doing what he's just accused me on the just now. And we didn't do it that way. The nurses had no role in the randomization. We have documented equal numbers of women referred for abnormalities found by the nurses to the breast review clinics staffed by the study surgeons in the mammography group and in the clinical examination group and then the control group. So we have these data. They're published. They're available for Dr. Kopens to see. He ignores them.
Those of us who can no longer imagine our lives without access to a computer also have to contend with the question of how this technology is changing us. All technologies, starting with fire, the bow and arrow, and the wheel, have also changed us. But digital communication extends our reach. It allows us to be in places we've never visited, establish important connections with people we've never met. According to our next guest, these new technologies can turn us into, in Latin, Homo globalis. And is that a good thing? Well, let's find out from Carlos Strenger. He is chair of the Clinical Graduate Program at the Department of Psychology at Tel Aviv University, also the author of Fear of Insignificance, Searching for Meaning in the 21st Century, and we're happy to have you here at TVO. Welcome.
Hello.
Okay, the qualities that Homo globalis has, you describe them in the book. Share them with us here, if you would.
Well, first and foremost, it has pretty much turned all of us into people who have the globe at our fingertips. We just need an internet connection, and whether we like it or not, we're flooded by icons, stories, videos, pictures, images, from all over the place. This, in many respects, has very positive results because, at least in some cases, or in many cases, it turns us into more open-minded people. We're becoming aware of the fact that there are many, many ways of living, that there are cultures that are very different from ours, and that those people who look very strange if we don't know much about them are actually quite similar to us when it comes to human nature.
On the other hand,
it turns out that human nature doesn't really evolve at the pace of technology at all. And what psychological research has shown very clearly is how deep the need of all of us is to have a relatively well-defined group, tradition, culture that we belong to, and where we feel that we're making a difference.
So as it opens up to the world, to us, it also encourages the wrong word, but provokes us to feel somewhat insignificant in the world.
It actually makes it very difficult for many of us to feel significant. In the past, if you were the baker or the lawyer or the doctor of your quarter, of your city, of your town, you felt that you were of significance. And now many, many of us are actually in professions where we keep being connected to the globe as a whole. So suddenly the field of comparison and the relevant frame of reference has pretty much exploded and is now so huge that the question, am I really of significance? Is any of what I do of any significance at all? Has become a question that's much more difficult to answer.
Do you think that is a rational reaction to the phenomena that we're now dealing with?
I wouldn't say it's a rational reaction. I would say it's an unavoidable reaction. And it has had some impact that is not quite easy to deal with. First of all, when we suddenly can no longer take our own frame of reference for granted, one of the things we do is that we desperately look for something objective to measure whether what we do and who we are is of significance. And it's amazing how the wider culture reflects that. In the last 15 years or so, there is a worldwide explosion of ranking and rating scales. In the past, you used to have Forbes' richest people, Fortune's largest companies. Now you have everything. Forbes doesn't just have the richest, the most influential, the most beautiful, the most sexy, the best known, etc. Now each country has these scales, and most larger cities have rating scales of that sort. And I can tell you, I know a few publishers of magazines who have these scales. They tell me that in the month before they publish it, the world goes berserk. The PR agents flood them. You can't drop my client from number 2 to number 4. He's making more money. He's more influential.
You're serious? This happens?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So we're desperate to be on these lists, and when we don't show up on these lists, it exacerbates the phenomena you're talking about.
And now what's so interesting, you'll tell me, okay, but that's a very small elite. I mean, who is on the Time 100s list? Who is on? But what actually happened meanwhile is that every kid has a Facebook account. And so it may not be how many 100,000 Google entries are there on me, but how many likes did I get for my last selfie? And what I'm actually trying to do is not to make fun of this phenomenon, but to explain what in the general culture and in the constellation within which we live has kind of pushed us towards this deification of the quantifiable self. It's actually quite interesting. I see this in my clinical practice. In a very paradoxical way, people who are in relatively prestigious professions and who have actually achieved quite a bit, in a sense, suffer more from it because they feel that they're competing against, the biggest, the largest, and the greatest. In academia, we're not supposed to be preoccupied by things like that at all. It has taken over completely because your value now depends on how influential your journal is and how often you're quoted. So basically, the value of an academic is a number.
So what is the psychological impact of this phenomenon that you're describing?
One impact is a persistent sense that I haven't done enough. Because what has happened along with this, the explosion in information technology, is also that we are living in a myth, a cultural myth, which is that if you just really try hard enough, anything is possible. And the immortal slogan that Nike invented in 1988, "Just do it," has kind of become the icon of our time. I'm not trying to say that Nike in any way is responsible for that. It just hit the zeitgeist in a way that...
It's a reflection of something that was out there already.
That was there already. And you see people who keep feeling, I could have done more, I could have done more, others have done more. And then don't forget that today we're all flooded through the global infotainment system with global success stories that are truly staggering. I'm not even talking about the ones that are slightly on the verge of ridiculous, let's say, Gangnam Style getting 1.5 million YouTube views. I'm talking about the fact that Sergey Brin and Larry Page, by the age of 30, literally had transformed the world. Mm-hmm. Mark Zuckerberg, by the age of 27, literally had transformed the world.
So what have you done today? Right? I mean, that's the...
Yeah, so you say, okay, so I've published 7 books and I've written X article. This is absolutely nothing. That's ridiculous.
Let me go out on a bit of a tangent with this then. If you also, as you become Homo globalis, so you have a wider opening to the understanding of the world and the possibilities of the world and the good things, and you realize relative to all of that you may be fairly insignificant. Is another impact that you're less rooted in the community in which you live, less civic-minded, you care less about what happens in your own hometown?
Okay, that's a really, really complex issue. Because you see, what happens is that I don't think that it necessarily makes you less civic-minded, but your relevant community may not necessarily be the community that you physically live with. Let's say you're an astrophysicist, okay? The people who are really your community are a worldwide network of not too many people who speak your language. Let's say very often I feel that I'm actually much closer to a network of people who share my values, my core values, which are very universalistic, which very much are concerned with human rights, than I necessarily feel connected to my neighbor who may have very different values from my own. So I don't think that it necessarily means that you're less civic-minded, but it certainly can mean that many people feel that their communities are no longer localized, but spread all over the globe.
And that is the Agenda's Week in Review. You can see all of those programs in their entirety. They're all on our website, theagenda.tvo.org, on our iTunes channel, and on our YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/theagenda.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.